It was an ordinary day on Earth when the world was changed forever. Scientists at the SETI Institute in California were monitoring deep space signals, just as they had done for years, searching for a hint, a whisper, that would indicate they were not alone in the universe. The world had been waiting for a discovery like this, hoping for proof that humanity was not the only intelligent life form in the vast expanse of the cosmos. What they found, however, was not just a signal. At first, it seemed like an anomaly, just a spike in the data that could be explained away by interference or a glitch. But this time, something felt different. Dr. Sarah Ellison, the lead scientist at SETI, felt a strange sense of unease as she stared at the readings. It wasn't just the frequency of the signal, it was its pattern. The signal was structured, deliberate. Someone, or something, was trying to communicate. She couldn't shake the feeling that this was it. The moment humanity had waited for. With a sense of urgency, she and her team began working around the clock, trying to decipher the transmission. Hours passed, and the world's attention slowly shifted from the usual political squabbles and global tensions to the realization that something extraordinary was happening. Governments around the world were alerted, and the atmosphere shifted from skepticism to cautious optimism. By the next morning, the signal source had been traced, a distant star system, over 40 light-years away. It was as if the stars themselves had opened a door for humanity, inviting them to step beyond the boundaries of their small world. The signal didn't contain words, at least not in any recognizable language. It was a series of complex patterns, mathematical formulas, geometric shapes, and sequences of prime numbers. Yet, the underlying message was clear: intelligent life had found them. Humanity was no longer isolated in the cold, dark silence of space. News outlets across the globe broadcasted the event, and the entire planet held its breath, waiting for the next transmission. Would this be the beginning of something monumental, or was it all just an elaborate hoax? Dr. Ellison and her team worked tirelessly to decode the signal's meaning, and after days of intense study, they made a breakthrough. The transmission wasn't just a greeting, it was an invitation. The message, once unraveled, revealed a simple but profound statement: we are coming. The implications of this were staggering. The world's leaders scrambled to understand what this could mean. Were these visitors peaceful? Or would they bring destruction to the fragile human civilization? No one knew. What followed was a wave of mixed emotions: excitement, fear, hope, and anxiety. At the United Nations headquarters, an emergency summit was called. World leaders gathered, their faces a mix of skepticism and wonder as they discussed the implications of the signal. Some proposed a coordinated response, sending a message of peace back to the visitors, while others feared the worst, advocating for defensive measures in case the visitors were hostile. The debate was heated, with factions emerging, each believing they knew how best to prepare for the unknown. Meanwhile, on the streets, the atmosphere was electric. People gathered in public squares, their faces glued to the news broadcasts as they waited for updates. The world's religions had their own interpretations of the event. Some saw it as a divine revelation, while others questioned the very nature of human existence. How would humanity react to the realization that they were not the pinnacle of intelligence in the universe? Back in California, Dr. Ellison stood in front of a large screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The signal had been quiet for days, but as she scanned the data, she noticed something strange. A new signal, faint at first, was starting to emerge. It wasn't like the previous transmissions, it was faster, more urgent. With trembling hands, Dr. Ellison initiated the decoding sequence once again, her heart racing. This time, the message was different. Prepare yourselves, it said. The world would soon learn the truth. The arrival of the visitors was no longer a matter of speculation. It was only a matter of time before the alien presence would reveal itself in full. As days passed, humanity grew restless. The strange, cryptic messages from the visitors had sent shockwaves across the globe. Governments, scientists, and civilians alike were desperate for answers. The waiting game had begun. Dr. Sarah Ellison and her team continued to study the signals, trying to decipher more of the alien transmission. But then, something unexpected happened. The signal stopped. The pattern they had been so intent on deciphering vanished, leaving nothing but static in its wake. It was as if the visitors had abruptly gone silent, leaving humanity to wonder whether they had misinterpreted the messages or whether the visitors had changed their minds. The silence weighed heavily on the world. Politicians in every corner of the globe scrambled to find a narrative that would reassure their citizens, but there was no denying the tension in the air. National leaders and military officials convened in secret meetings, each trying to anticipate what might come next. The threat of an unknown alien force was now a very real possibility, and humanity, for the first time in history, found itself united in its fear of what lay beyond Earth's atmosphere. The global media outlets had a field day with the speculation. Some channels were already preparing for the worst, broadcasting apocalyptic scenarios of hostile alien invasions, while others held out hope that the silence meant the visitors were taking their time to assess humanity. The uncertainty played out on every screen, with millions tuning in for updates, desperately trying to piece together what the future might hold. Despite the absence of signals, something had changed in the world. Space exploration had received an unprecedented boost in funding. Nations that had previously been at odds found themselves cooperating, united by the shared experience of potentially making contact with extraterrestrial life. The prospect of unknown technologies, ancient knowledge, and new frontiers in space exploration ignited a wave of curiosity and ambition. Humanity, once small and confined to a single planet, now saw itself as a part of something much greater. Dr. Ellison, however, could not shake the feeling that the silence was not an end, but a prelude to something far more significant. She and her team worked tirelessly, poring over every bit of data, every frequency, and every coded message they had received. What was the true meaning behind "prepare yourselves"? Was this just a warning, or was it an invitation to a new chapter in human history? Then, one day, as if on cue, the world's communications systems were overloaded by a single, powerful burst of energy. Every screen in every city flickered on simultaneously, broadcasting the same message: "We have arrived." It wasn't just the message itself that sent waves of shock across the globe, it was the sheer magnitude of the event. No one had anticipated this kind of direct communication. The words were simple, but their implications were enormous. The visitors, whoever they were, had chosen to reveal themselves. In every city, crowds gathered. People stared at their screens in awe, unsure of how to respond. Governments quickly mobilized, and military units were placed on high alert. The world's military might was now united not against each other, but against a common unknown. For the first time, humanity was no longer divided by borders, they were united in their uncertainty. Across the world, people wondered, were the visitors coming in peace? Or would they demand something humanity wasn't ready to give? What did they mean by, "We have arrived"? Was this a declaration of war or the start of an unprecedented collaboration? Dr. Ellison, still reeling from the suddenness of the transmission, focused on her screen. The words, "We have arrived," were followed by a cryptic set of coordinates, precise and calculated. This wasn't a vague threat or a random broadcast. The message had been meant for Earth, and it was meant to be understood. The coordinates pointed to a location in the Pacific Ocean, a remote and uninhabited part of the world. A place that had never been explored in depth. It was clear that the visitors had chosen this location for a reason. Was it a meeting place? A landing site? Or perhaps something else entirely? The world held its breath. As the hours passed, the world's leaders began to make plans for an expedition to the coordinates. A global alliance was formed, one that included scientists, diplomats, and military personnel. It was the first step toward making contact in person with the visitors, but no one knew what awaited them at the chosen location. The message had been clear, but its meaning was still shrouded in mystery. There was a collective realization that humanity was standing on the precipice of a new era. What would they find when they arrived? Would it be a moment of enlightenment, or the beginning of something far darker? The world's leaders, scientists, and military strategists had only a few days to prepare. The coordinates sent by the visitors pointed to a remote island in the Pacific Ocean, an uninhabited speck on the map that had long been ignored by both explorers and cartographers. It was as if the visitors had chosen this location deliberately, far from human civilization, ensuring that their arrival would be under the careful supervision of those in power. As preparations for the expedition ramped up, an air of both excitement and fear gripped the planet. Governments from every corner of the Earth quickly assembled the best and brightest, engineers, biologists, military experts, and diplomats, all tasked with the monumental responsibility of making first contact. The military had its own interests, ensuring that the alien presence would not be a threat to humanity. But the scientific community saw the opportunity as a once-in-a-lifetime chance to understand the vastness of the universe, to answer questions that had plagued humankind for millennia. Dr. Sarah Ellison was chosen to lead the scientific delegation. Her expertise had made her the face of humanity's attempt to understand the visitor's signal, and now, she was entrusted with the mission to meet them in person. Despite her initial excitement, doubt lingered in her mind. The messages had been cryptic, filled with ambiguities, and the silence that followed made it clear that there was much more to the visitors' intentions than anyone could yet comprehend. What kind of technology did they possess? What did they want from Earth? The questions were endless, and the answers, far from clear. The team arrived at the location by air and sea, carrying advanced equipment for both scientific investigation and military reconnaissance. The island was desolate, covered in dense tropical vegetation and jagged cliffs that made it nearly inaccessible. As the team approached the shore, a sense of awe settled over them. They were about to witness the unimaginable, the moment that would change the course of history forever. Dr. Ellison stepped onto the sand, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on her shoulders. She was surrounded by a team of scientists and military personnel, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of the alien presence. There was no structure in sight, no sign of civilization. The island appeared to be completely untouched. Then, as the sun began to dip beneath the horizon, something changed. A strange hum filled the air, resonating through the earth beneath their feet. The sound was like nothing they had ever heard before, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the very core of the planet. The team instinctively looked around, their eyes searching for the source of the disturbance. Without warning, the ground in front of them began to ripple, as if the very fabric of reality was being bent. In an instant, a massive structure began to emerge from the earth, a towering monolith of smooth, metallic material that shimmered in the fading light. It was unlike anything humanity had ever seen, an architectural wonder, alien in both design and scale. The structure was circular, with intricate symbols etched into its surface. It pulsed with an eerie glow, and as it rose from the ground, the humming sound grew louder, vibrating in their bones. The team stood frozen, mesmerized by the sight. The visitors were here, right before their eyes. Dr. Ellison took a cautious step forward, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent years studying the signal, but nothing could have prepared her for this. This was real. The visitors were no longer just an abstract idea, they were tangible, physical, and they had arrived on Earth. The monolith, now fully visible, seemed to hover just above the ground, its base glowing with an ethereal light. There were no visible doors or windows, no means of entry that the team could see. The structure was not merely a vessel, it was a message in itself. The visitors had chosen to reveal their presence in this way, not through words, but through their technology, their sheer power to manipulate the environment around them. The air was thick with tension as the team members exchanged wary glances. What would happen next? Would the visitors step out of the structure, or would they remain hidden within their vessel? Everyone stood at the ready, waiting for the next move. And then, without warning, a deep, resonant voice echoed through the air. It was not a human voice, yet it was somehow familiar, as if it resonated in their very minds. The voice was calm, almost soothing, but there was an undeniable power behind it. "Welcome," the voice said, "to the next phase of your existence." The words hit Dr. Ellison like a bolt of lightning. There was no mistaking it now, the visitors had come, and they had come with purpose. Humanity had reached the precipice of a new era, one that promised to challenge everything they knew about their place in the universe. But the voice continued, and with it came a chilling warning. The test begins now. The voice that resonated through the air was like a bell tolling, reverberating in the minds of every individual on the island. The test begins now. Those words hung in the air like a heavy fog, their meaning shrouded in mystery. Dr. Sarah Ellison stood motionless, her heart racing. The alien presence had finally made itself known, but what did it mean by the test? The world had waited for this moment, but now, with the visitors standing before them in silence, the true nature of their arrival was far more intimidating than anyone had anticipated. The team remained on high alert, their weapons close at hand, their senses heightened. The military personnel had been instructed to be ready for any eventuality, but they were just as unsure as the scientists about what was unfolding. No one knew what to expect. Was this a test of strength, of intellect, or of morality? The monolith pulsed again, brighter this time, and the hum intensified, filling the air like a vibrating tension. Suddenly, the earth beneath the structure cracked open, and from within, a series of platforms rose, each one carrying a different object. The visitors had not made physical contact yet, but they were certainly revealing their technology. Dr. Ellison's team, along with the military, approached the platforms cautiously. The objects were strange, each one covered in intricate symbols that none of them could decipher. There were spherical devices that seemed to float above the platforms, cubes that shimmered with an internal light, and long, twisting structures that resembled a cross between organic growths and mechanical components. It was clear that the visitors had not come to simply observe, they had come to challenge humanity. One of the military officers, a seasoned captain named Marcus Davis, took a step forward and raised a hand, signaling to his team. "Stay back," he ordered. "We don't know what these things do." Dr. Ellison, despite the fear gnawing at her stomach, was drawn toward one of the spherical devices. There was something almost hypnotic about it, the way it seemed to pulse in time with her heartbeat. A curiosity she couldn't suppress pushed her forward, despite the warnings. She reached out cautiously, her fingers brushing the surface of the sphere. Suddenly, the air around her crackled with energy, and the sphere glowed brightly, almost blindingly. Dr. Ellison stepped back in shock, but before she could react, the voice returned. "Humanity has always sought to test its limits," it said. "Now, you will be tested in turn." Before anyone could fully comprehend the implications of the message, the ground beneath them shifted once again. The platform beneath the sphere descended into the earth, revealing an opening. The monolith opened as well, its once smooth surface now divided into sections, revealing an intricate network of glowing pathways, like veins coursing through the structure. From within the monolith, a figure emerged. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely alien either. The being was tall, thin, with a translucent exoskeleton that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Its form was humanoid, yet fluid, like something that could not be confined to a single shape. The visitors had finally shown themselves. The being raised one of its elongated arms, and with a single motion, it directed its hand toward the team. A wave of energy rippled from its fingertips, and the symbols on the devices around them began to shift, rearranging themselves like an elaborate puzzle. The air grew tense, the quiet before the storm growing heavier with each passing second. "The test," the being spoke, its voice now clear, though still echoing in their minds, "is not one of violence, but of choice. Your species has reached a crossroads. You must decide, will you continue on your current path, one of division and conflict, or will you transcend and unite? This is your challenge." Dr. Ellison felt a wave of disbelief. Was this really happening? The visitors weren't here to conquer or destroy, they were here to test humanity's worth. It wasn't a test of technology or strength, but of unity. The visitors wanted to see if humans could overcome their divisions, their differences, and come together as one. A low murmur rippled through the group, a mixture of confusion and fear. How could they possibly prove their worth in such a way? The world had been fractured for centuries, torn apart by war, greed, and hatred. The idea that humanity could simply come together in peace seemed impossible. But the visitors had made it clear, this was the only way forward. The being gestured to the strange objects now floating above the platforms, and the symbols they displayed shifted once more, forming an intricate web of interconnected lines. It was a map of Earth, a map that pulsed with energy, highlighting areas of conflict, war, and division. The being spoke again. These are the places where your species has faltered. The question is simple: will you choose to overcome them, or will you fail? Dr. Ellison's mind raced. Was this a test of cooperation? Of global unity? Was humanity truly ready for such a challenge? And if they failed, what would the consequences be? Would the visitors leave, or would they judge humanity unworthy? But before anyone could voice their thoughts, the being raised its arm again, and the ground beneath them vibrated one last time. The monolith retracted back into the earth, leaving behind nothing but the echoes of its presence. The silence that followed was deafening, and the tension in the air seemed to hang like a storm cloud, ready to burst. The test had begun. Humanity had been given a choice, one that would define their future. Would they rise to the occasion, or would they remain the fractured species they had always been? The test had begun, and with it, a torrent of emotions and opinions surged through humanity. The visitors, their enigmatic challenge lingering over them, had left the island, but their words and the implications of their test had not. Back on Earth, the message was clear: humanity's future was not in their hands alone. It was up to each individual, each nation, to decide whether they would choose unity or division. The news networks were flooded with conflicting messages. Some saw the visitors' challenge as a gift, an opportunity to unite and advance as a species. Others viewed it as a threat, a way for the alien visitors to judge humanity's worth, to see if they could rise above their ingrained conflicts and make a lasting change. Dr. Sarah Ellison, shaken but resolute, had returned to the United Nations with her team. The summit that followed the expedition was tense, full of heated debates and intense discussions. Governments worldwide were scrambling to interpret the visitors' test and decide how best to respond. It was clear that the world's leaders were divided. Some saw this as an opportunity for a new world order, while others feared that any concession to unity would be seen as weakness. In the days following the test, global reactions splintered further. The challenge the visitors had posed to humanity's unity had tapped into deep-rooted fears, insecurities, and long-standing animosities. Old political rivalries flared up, nationalistic fervor surged, and divisions that many thought had been buried resurfaced in full force. The U.S. president, alongside European leaders, proposed a bold response: a global summit in which every nation would sign a treaty committing to peace and collaboration. They argued that this was the only way to prove humanity's worth. The message was clear: if Earth could unite in a single purpose, it would send a powerful signal to the visitors, and to the universe, that humanity was ready for what lay ahead. But not everyone agreed. In Moscow, Russian leadership issued a counter-statement, accusing the West of trying to impose its ideals on the rest of the world. "This is not the time for submission," one prominent official declared. "We must remain sovereign. The visitors have not demanded our submission, why should we give it?" In the Middle East, leaders from various nations were hesitant, seeing the challenge as a foreign imposition on deeply ingrained religious and cultural values. Some saw the visitors' test as an affront to their identity, interpreting it as an alien attempt to erase their traditions and history. On the streets of cities across the globe, protests erupted. People expressed their fears, their hopes, and their doubts. Was this test a trap? Was it really about unity, or was it a means for the visitors to manipulate humanity into submission? A growing chorus of voices argued that humanity should not bend to alien judgment, that they should resist and protect their independence, no matter the cost. As global leaders grappled with how to respond, Dr. Ellison found herself at the center of a storm of questions. The visitors had not returned, and the tension that filled the air was suffocating. Would humanity choose to rise to the challenge? Or would it fracture, as it had always done, under the weight of its divisions? The weight of history hung heavy on her mind. For all the advancements humanity had made, for all the progress in technology, society had not overcome its oldest flaws. Greed, fear, and the lust for power continued to divide the people of Earth. And now, facing the visitors' challenge, those very flaws threatened to tear the world apart at the seams. At the United Nations, the pressure was building. A vote was imminent, one that could decide whether humanity would attempt to come together, to heal the fractures that had plagued it for centuries. It wasn't just a vote for peace, it was a vote for the future. Dr. Ellison had been called to speak, to represent the scientific community and the global alliance that had formed in the wake of the visitors' arrival. She stood at the podium, her voice steady, but her mind racing. Behind her were representatives from every corner of the earth, their eyes fixed on her. Her words could shape the future, could influence whether humanity would rise to meet the challenge or crumble under the weight of its divisions. "We stand at a crossroads," she began. "The visitors have given us a choice. They have not asked us to surrender our individuality, nor have they demanded we abandon our culture. They have only asked one thing of us: can we come together? Can we overcome the fear that has held us back, the hatred that has divided us, and the greed that has torn us apart?" The room was silent. She could feel the weight of their gazes, the tension crackling in the air. "This is not just about peace between nations," she continued. "It is about transcending the very nature of conflict itself. It is about understanding that, in the vastness of the cosmos, we are not alone. And in this moment, we have the chance to show that we are worthy of the opportunity to join the greater universe." There was a long pause, and the weight of the moment hung in the air. But as Dr. Ellison looked around the room, she saw something she hadn't expected: hope. For the first time since the visitors' challenge had been issued, she saw faces willing to consider something different. Could it be? Could humanity really rise above its old ways? But as the debate continued, Dr. Ellison knew that the answer wasn't simple. The visitors had set the stage for humanity to make its choice, and while some were ready to embrace unity, others remained entrenched in fear and distrust. The fractures were too deep, too ingrained. The fate of the world hung in the balance, and the clock was ticking. Would humanity choose to stand together, or would it succumb to its divisions? The world watched with bated breath as the United Nations vote approached. The debate had reached a fever pitch. Dr. Sarah Ellison stood at the center of it all, caught between hope and doubt. The weight of humanity's future hung in the balance, and the choice before them was as stark as it was critical. Unity or division? Cooperation or conflict? The room in the United Nations headquarters was filled with tension, the air heavy with anticipation. Representatives from all corners of the globe were gathered, each one facing a decision that could reshape human history. Every nation had its own interests, its own fears, its own perspective on the visitor's test. Some saw it as an opportunity for progress, a chance to prove humanity's worth to the alien beings who had arrived in their midst. Others saw it as a threat, an imposition that would erase their sovereignty, their identity, their independence. Dr. Ellison glanced around the room. The eyes of the world were on her, on the leaders of the nations, and on the very idea of humanity itself. She had spent so much of her life studying the visitors' signal, decoding their messages, and now, she stood at the precipice of something much greater. This was no longer just about science, or even about the visitors. This was about humanity's ability to overcome its greatest flaw, its inability to come together as one. The first vote was cast, and the results were announced almost immediately. A majority of nations had voted in favor of unity, but not by a large margin. The divide was clear. The Global South, which had long struggled with inequality, had overwhelmingly supported the idea of collaboration, seeing it as a chance to level the playing field. But the Global North, especially in the most powerful nations, remained deeply skeptical. They feared the loss of autonomy and the potential costs of giving in to an alien powers test. As the votes continued, the tension in the room grew palpable. Dr. Ellison had spoken passionately about the need for humanity to rise above its divisions, but even she wasn't sure if it would be enough. In the final moments of the vote, a last-minute amendment proposed by China threatened to throw the entire process into chaos. It called for the test to be delayed, giving nations more time to prepare. The amendment was supported by several countries, but it was a risky move, one that might weaken humanity's standing in the eyes of the visitors. When the final vote was tallied, it was clear that the world had narrowly avoided disaster. The proposal for unity had passed by the smallest of margins, with just enough countries agreeing to move forward with the idea of global collaboration. But it wasn't a unanimous decision. There were cracks in the foundation, fractures that could not be ignored. And the visitors had been watching. The morning after the vote, as Dr. Ellison prepared for her next briefing, the world was shaken by a new broadcast. The sky above every major city flickered with static, and once again, the visitor's voice echoed across the globe. This time, however, there was something different in their tone. It was colder, more calculating. The voice was not one of curiosity anymore, but of expectation. "You have made your choice," the voice intoned. "You have chosen unity, but not without resistance. You have proven that even in the face of the greatest challenge, division still runs deep. This is a step forward, but only a small one." The voice paused, and the tension in the air became unbearable. "We will now begin the next phase of the test," it continued. "If you truly wish to prove that you are ready for the next stage of existence, you must show that unity is not just a decision, it is a lasting force. It must be woven into every aspect of your society, your politics, your cultures. It must be stronger than any division, any conflict." Dr. Ellison's heart sank. The visitors were not simply judging humanity's willingness to unite, they were demanding a transformation. And that transformation had to be real, not just a political gesture. "We will be watching," the voice concluded. "We will be waiting." And then, as suddenly as it had come, the transmission ended. The world was left in stunned silence, the weight of the visitors' words settling like a heavy cloud over the planet. As the days passed, the gravity of the visitors' demand began to set in. Global leaders scrambled to make good on their promises, but the path ahead was anything but clear. The fractures within society were not easily healed. Nations began to implement sweeping reforms, pushing for economic and social equality, but the old divisions ran deep. Nationalist movements, regional disputes, and entrenched ideologies refused to be silenced. In the streets of Paris, protests erupted. Citizens demanded action, but many questioned whether the governments could truly bring about the unity the visitors had asked for. In Rio de Janeiro, activists called for more immediate and far-reaching changes, while in Moscow, resistance groups decried what they saw as an encroachment on their national sovereignty. The challenge had not been just about voting for unity, it was about making unity a living, breathing part of everyday life. It was about undoing centuries of inequality, of conflict, of distrust. But amidst the chaos, there were moments of hope. Grassroots organizations, fueled by the desire for a better future, began to form in cities across the world. Ordinary citizens, many of whom had long been marginalized, found themselves at the forefront of efforts to forge a new way of life. They reached across borders, building networks of cooperation and solidarity that transcended old divisions. People from different cultures and backgrounds, once at odds, found themselves working together for a common cause. Dr. Ellison watched from afar, torn between optimism and fear. Could humanity truly rise to this challenge? Could the divisions that had defined human history be bridged, not just politically, but at the deepest level? The visitors had given humanity a glimpse of its potential, but whether it could fully realize that potential remained to be seen. As the weeks passed, the weight of the visitors' demands began to reveal cracks in humanity's newfound resolve. At first, the global efforts to implement unity seemed promising. There was a sense of purpose in the air. Countries and citizens alike had begun to address the long-standing divisions that had plagued the world for centuries. New laws were passed in some nations to improve economic equality, while global cooperation on climate change initiatives appeared stronger than ever. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the world was moving in the right direction. But the reality of these changes was far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. The old wounds ran deep. Societies that had been fractured by decades of conflict and inequality struggled to heal, despite the pressure to conform to the visitors' challenge. In every nation, the push for unity began to unravel in subtle, yet powerful ways. In the United States, for example, the divisiveness between political parties grew more pronounced, even as the government worked to push forward international collaboration. The progress on climate change was overshadowed by political gridlock and ideological battles. The national identity, built on a foundation of individualism and freedom, felt at odds with the sense of collective responsibility that the visitors had demanded. Meanwhile, in regions of Africa and the Middle East, efforts to implement global reforms were often met with resistance from factions within governments, as well as local groups that were unwilling to embrace such sweeping changes. In Europe, the unity that had been proposed in the wake of the visitors' challenge was met with protests. Citizens, frustrated with economic hardship, questioned whether their leaders were truly committed to global cooperation or merely seeking to maintain control. Meanwhile, in Asia, the growing tensions between China and its neighbors over territorial disputes threatened to destabilize the progress that had been made. These tensions were further exacerbated by a sudden increase in cyber attacks targeting global communication networks, sowing fear and confusion among the nations who had pledged to work together. It wasn't just at the level of government where the cracks began to show. In cities around the world, people who had once hoped for unity were now feeling betrayed. In the streets of Paris, workers' unions clashed with reformists who believed that the promises of global cooperation had only served to benefit the elite. In Rio de Janeiro, protests against inequality turned violent, as the demands for a new world order were seen as an empty promise by those left behind. Even in Tokyo, the once unified push for international cooperation was marred by intense debates on national sovereignty. As the fractures deepened, the world began to question if humanity could truly meet the visitors' challenge. Were the visitors' demands simply too high? Were they expecting the impossible? Could humanity truly transcend its deepest divisions, or was it doomed to repeat its history of conflict and division? It was in this charged atmosphere that Dr. Sarah Ellison was called back to the United Nations. The visitor's voice had returned, and this time, the tone was different. There was no longer a sense of curiosity or even expectation. There was only cold judgment. "You have failed," the voice echoed across the globe, its words reverberating through the minds of all who heard it. "Your efforts to unite are insufficient. The cracks in your society are too deep, and your actions too inconsistent. You have taken a step forward, but only to fall back into your old patterns." Dr. Ellison felt a chill run through her. The visitors had made their decision, and it was clear now that they were no longer simply observers, they were judging humanity's every move. But what did it mean that they had failed? Was there any hope left for humanity to prove itself worthy? The visitor's voice continued, offering no solace. "Unity cannot be a fleeting goal. It must be woven into every aspect of your civilization, from your politics to your social fabric. It must be forged through the hearts and minds of every individual. This is the test we have set before you, and you have not passed." The world was left in stunned silence, the weight of the visitor's judgment sinking in. It felt as though the air itself had become thick, suffocating with the knowledge that humanity had not measured up. But amid the despair, one question remained: could humanity still rise to meet the challenge? Or had they truly lost their chance? In the aftermath of the visitor's pronouncement, the global atmosphere became tense, almost desperate. The world's leaders scrambled to explain their failures and find a way to meet the visitors' expectations, but the damage had been done. The cracks in the unity effort were now impossible to ignore. Leaders who had once championed the idea of cooperation were now shifting blame, pointing fingers at each other and refusing to acknowledge the deep-seated issues within their own societies. Dr. Ellison, torn between disappointment and determination, found herself once again at the forefront of the crisis. As a scientist and as a human being, she had always believed in the power of knowledge and reason. But now, as the visitors' challenge became more than just a political issue, she realized that the heart of the problem lay not in the political structures, nor in the economic systems. The real question was whether humanity could overcome its deep-rooted instincts, its fears, its prejudices, and its history of division. In a last-ditch effort to answer the visitors' challenge, Dr. Ellison proposed something radical: a global council made up of citizens from every walk of life, not just politicians and elites, but ordinary people who had fought for justice, equality, and peace in their communities. She argued that only through grassroots collaboration, a true collective effort from all corners of society, could humanity prove that it was capable of the unity the visitors demanded. The idea was met with both hope and skepticism. Would it be enough to persuade the visitors? Or would it be too little, too late? The world had reached its breaking point. The visitors' cold judgment had fractured the fragile hope that had been carefully nurtured in the weeks following their first arrival. Humanity had failed to meet the high expectations set before them, and now it felt as though there was no path forward. But Dr. Sarah Ellison knew that the final test, the one that would decide humanity's future, had not yet come. In the days following the visitors' pronouncement of failure, the atmosphere on Earth became heavier. The once promising momentum toward unity had stalled. Nations retreated into their old ways, driven by fear and suspicion, unwilling to trust even their closest allies. The divisions that had been temporarily bridged now seemed insurmountable. People doubted their leaders and their governments, and the question hung in the air, was it too late for humanity to prove itself worthy? But as the days turned into weeks, there were whispers. A quiet rebellion against the fatalism that had gripped the world. Across the globe, grassroots movements began to grow stronger, with people who refused to accept the visitors' judgment as the final word. They had seen what unity could accomplish, however imperfectly, and they weren't ready to give up on that dream. They took to the streets, organized forums, and began forming local councils to bridge divides. It wasn't about the governments anymore, it was about the people, and they were determined to make their voices heard. Dr. Ellison, still reeling from the visitors' harsh words, found herself drawn into these movements. She saw in them a spark of hope, a willingness to fight for something greater. The scientists, engineers, activists, and everyday citizens who had once struggled against the forces of division were now rallying together, united by a single cause, to prove that humanity was capable of lasting, meaningful unity. It was during one of these gatherings that Dr. Ellison was contacted once again by the visitors. The message was simple, almost clinical, with no hint of warmth or empathy. The voice echoed into the hearts of every individual who heard it, reverberating across the world like an unshakable tremor. Humanity, you have shown that you can come together in fleeting moments. But now, we ask you to do what you have not done before, to sustain this unity across time, through adversity, and despite the forces that have torn you apart. Your last test is not to create peace in a single moment, but to show that it can be maintained, regardless of the challenges you face. The words stung with their finality. The visitors were no longer asking for a simple demonstration of unity, they were demanding that humanity show it could endure. That it could rise above the fractures of the past and forge a future together. But how could they do that when the entire world seemed on the verge of collapse? The visitors had given humanity a choice, to face their own limitations and surrender to their own history, or to rise above it and prove that they were ready for something greater. But Dr. Ellison knew that this wasn't just about humanity passing a test. It was about a fundamental shift in human consciousness. This wasn't merely an external challenge, it was a call to transform the very core of what it meant to be human. She rallied the international leaders, scientists, and grassroots movements that had been pushing for unity. Together, they crafted a bold new vision, a series of global initiatives focused not just on cooperation between nations, but on addressing the root causes of division within humanity itself. Education, healthcare, environmental sustainability, and economic justice became the cornerstones of the new movement. But it wasn't just about creating new policies, it was about creating new ways of thinking, of acting, of being. The world's leaders had failed to act in unity before, but this time, they would place the power in the hands of the people. Local councils, composed of individuals from all walks of life, would collaborate with global institutions to bring about lasting change. This was humanity's last chance to prove to the visitors that their flaws could be overcome, not by top-down mandates, but by a collective, global commitment to work together as equals. As the first wave of initiatives began to take root, the visitors' presence lingered in the background. But this time, their silence wasn't oppressive, it was expectant. They had given humanity the final test, and now, they would watch to see if it could succeed. The question was no longer whether humanity could prove it was capable of unity, it was whether humanity could prove that it could sustain that unity, even in the face of challenges. In the months that followed, the effects of the new global initiatives began to take hold. The world, though still deeply imperfect, showed signs of real change. People from different nations and cultures began to collaborate on common projects. The environment began to heal as countries worked together to address the climate crisis. Poverty rates began to fall as international aid, focused on sustainable development, reached those who had been left behind for too long. Wars didn't end overnight, but the violence of the past seemed to diminish as the world focused on dialogue rather than conflict. It was clear that humanity had not solved all of its problems. There were still forces of division, political, economic, and cultural, that threatened the delicate progress being made. But there was something different now. A spirit of cooperation and hope had begun to take root, and people felt as though they were part of something bigger than themselves. Dr. Ellison, standing at the forefront of the global transformation, saw this as the beginning of something new. It wasn't perfect, and the challenges were far from over, but the test had been passed. Humanity had proven that it could change, that it could come together to face the impossible. And when the visitor's voice finally returned, it was no longer cold or judgmental. This time, it carried a sense of reverence, as though acknowledging the progress humanity had made. Humanity, the voice said, you have proven that you are capable of more than we anticipated. You have shown us that even in the face of great challenges, you can rise above your flaws and build something better. You have passed the test. The path forward is yours to create. The final judgment had been delivered, and humanity stood victorious, not because it had conquered the stars, but because it had finally learned how to come together. The visitors had not simply given humanity a challenge, they had given it a chance. And humanity, against all odds, had seized that chance. Was over. The real journey had just begun.